It is work in progress on the Houses of Parliament. There is scaffolding everywhere, but the business of politics goes on. And in a short while, the Queen will arrive here at the Sovereign's entrance, ready to open a new session, ready to unveil a new programme of legislation by the government. There'll be less of the glittering pageantry of recent years. That's because of the COVID restrictions. But there'll be plenty to see, trust me, at the state opening of Parliament for 2021. Very good morning from the Houses of Parliament, from our rather nice room overlooking the River Thames. And this is our home for the next couple of hours as we mark the opening of a new parliamentary session. It's been a time of national crisis since the last state opening back in December 2019. And the government's new programme will no doubt include measures to recover from the effects of the terrible pandemic. The Queen will attend today's event. It's her first major event since the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh. And Her Majesty will be accompanied this morning by the Prince of Wales. But the usual display of ceremonial splendour will be more or less absent because of the current restrictions. The other big difference is that the number of MPs and peers here today is rather limited. Now, the Queen's speech is being delivered just a few days after the extensive elections in Scotland, Wales and England, which gave new impetus, really, to the debate on the constitutional future of the United Kingdom. Now, earlier this morning, the Prime Minister emerged from Downing Street.
Will you be delivering on your promises today, Prime Minister?
Will he be delivering on his promises? Well, we'll be talking about that. He's on his way to the Houses of Parliament. Back in December 2019, he was celebrating his 80-strong majority and promising to get Brexit done. Well, 17 months later, the UK has indeed left the EU, and the government's efforts have been unavoidably devoted to fighting the pandemic. In another part of London, here's the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who's attending his first state opening as leader of the opposition. All smiles, but he has spent the past few days dealing with the fallout from Labour's performance in the elections that I mentioned, and we'll be talking a little more about that later. We'll be seeing the two leaders, really, Mr Johnson and Sir Keir, making their way to the House of Lords for the Queen's speech, along with a select band of MPs, far fewer in number. And talking of select bands, with me here in the River Room are representatives of the three biggest parties in the House of Commons. Gillian Keegan is with us, who is the Minister for Apprenticeships and Skills for the Conservatives. Welcome, Minister. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Joanna Cherry, who makes a return visit to this programme. We're grateful to her, for the Scottish National Party. Thank you, Joanna. Thangam Debonair, who is the Shadow Leader of the House of Commons for Labour, just appointed yesterday. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
And of course, the band would not be complete without the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuensberg. Laura, good to have you with us as ever. And before we talk to our guests in a few minutes' time, just for those viewers who are wondering what to expect today, apart from this rather scaled-back ceremonial, there's nothing scaled back about the actual contents of the speech.
Absolutely not. And while the Queen's speech is a sort of curious feature of how our political system works, it really matters because it's the opportunity that comes along every year or so for the government of the day to say, here are the things that we are really committed to doing. Here is the menu of laws that we're going to try and get through this place, through Parliament. And here are the ways in which we promise to help change the lives of voters. That all sounds rather grand. It all sounds rather a big deal, because it is. And I think today what we will see is the government coming forward, not just trying to keep the promises they made in their election manifesto in 2019, but also trying to add in a sense of pushing forward after the real health and economic emergency that we've all lived through over the last 12 months. But my goodness, promises are, of course, much easier to make than they are to keep. And I think a big feature of the political debate towards the back end of today will be how the government's actually going to go about keeping the commitments that they make.
In just a sentence, if viewers are wondering what the main point of the speech is, what will be the main feature in legislative terms, what will it be?
The government's jargon phrase, levelling up, which what it really means is trying to make the country more equal in terms of opportunity. But again, that's something that's very easy to say, but the details of what are promised really matter.
OK, we'll pick up on that with our guests in just a moment. But what a remarkable journey we've been on since the last state opening. Really, we need to ask about priorities for the government and for the other parties too. Now, I said that this will be not quite the all-out state ceremonial event we're used to, but, it's a big but, it doesn't mean there's no pageantry on offer, I'm glad to say. It is more understated and it's socially distanced, as you'd expect, but some of the familiar elements are still with us. Take the Yeomen of the Guard, here they are, the Royal Bodyguard founded by Henry Tudor after the Battle of Bosworth back in 1485. And they've been performing their ceremonial search of the cellars of Westminster, as they do for the state opening, directly above the cellars where Guy Fawkes was discovered back in 1605. Fewer than usual, there are normally around a dozen of them on duty today. But good to see them all the same. Member of the Parliamentary staff there, carrying the ceremonial key to the cellars. And then we have the ensign and the two members of the Yeomen of the Guard following. So that ceremonial search took place just a short while ago as they processed through the great, splendid space of the House of Lords, dominated, of course, by the throne. At the southern end of the Palace of Westminster, a short while ago, we saw the Sovereign's entrance. This is where the Queen will arrive within the hour, but there'll be no grand carriage procession this year. It'll be one of the royal cars bringing Her Majesty from Buckingham Palace to Westminster. And just inside that great space, which we saw a rather different scene to previous years, there will be just 32 peers in their ceremonial robes, sitting in strictly allocated places on the long red benches. The doors to the chamber opened at 10:15, so just over 20 minutes ago. But there's none of the usual rush to get a place. Possibly the most striking change is this. It's a single throne under that great golden canopy. There used to be a pair of thrones for the Queen and her consort. And this is where the Queen will be delivering the speech. Prince of Wales, the Duchess of Cornwall, sitting to one side on those state chairs. It's called the Queen's Speech, as Laura was saying, but it's worth reminding everyone once again that the contents are entirely the government's. And the usual arrangement is that the Lord Chancellor hands the speech to the Sovereign, but it's there today, look on the table. To minimise contact, the speech has been put there ready for Her Majesty when she arrives later. So there's just the start of the scene setting for you. So, you know, despite the fact that I said it was understated, as you'd expect within the palace, there's plenty of colour, and it's such a magnificent building inside, despite all the scaffolding outside, so we can still enjoy lots of the scenes as the state opening goes on. Minister, can I start with you and say, would you agree with Laura that the whole point of this speech really, the main kind of thrust of it, is this concept of levelling up? And for those viewers watching who still don't quite know what they're meant to make of that, what is it?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. That's been the key part of our programme. Obviously, we wanted to do that from the 2019 landslide, but that was overtaken by the pandemic, as you said. Levelling up effectively is this understanding, and I certainly understand this, that opportunity and talent are not equally matched in the country. So talent is equally spread all over the country, but the opportunity to go to a good school, to get to the right skills, to get the skills that actually are required by today's employers, which is also a moving feast, is something that we haven't spent enough time and attention on. So it's called, as the Secretary of State said, the other 50%, the 50% that don't go to university, making sure that they have very good career routes into many different careers that are the careers of the future. And that's really the crux of that programme. So, you know, if you're sat like I was in a Knowsley Comprehensive School right now, you get the same opportunity as somebody who goes to a much better school, or somebody who's perhaps got more networked parents or whatever. And it's really about focusing on those people. But also adults. There's a lot of adults that have left our school system or our further education system system that haven't got many qualifications, or the qualifications they've got are out of date as things have changed in the workplace. So it's also about giving those adults another shot at education that's free, that's provided by the government, and then for higher levels of education to have that loan system that easily can be accessed today for younger people to be freely accessed for everybody. So it's really revolutionising our technical education, and the last part of it is bringing employers into the heart of the system so that what you study when you leave is not a waste of time. It's something that's going to lead to a really brilliant job, because that's another key part of it that you don't, if you put your faith in the system delivers for you.
Lots of viewers, John, I have no doubt will think that sounds, those are noble aims.
Yes.
And they are possibly long overdue, some of those reforms. What will your attitude be to that set of reforms, and would you be supporting them?
Well, these reforms, of course, will be mainly targeted on England and some on England and Wales, because in Scotland we have a devolved parliament and a devolved government. And of course, the SNP have just had a historic fourth election win in a row in Scotland, with the largest share of the vote that we have ever received at a Scottish election, considerably higher than Boris Johnson received in his great landslide in December 2019. Many of the sort of measures that Gillian is talking about are the kind of measures that the SNP have employed in Scotland over the last 14 years, which is why our governments have been so popular. But what I would say to Gillian and her colleagues is that inequality across the United Kingdom has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And if you really want to tackle inequality, then you have to have an investment-led recovery that looks at the roots of inequality and also looks at the flaws in our tax system. We need a more progressive tax system, such as we have in Scotland. We need to tax some of these big companies who are getting away with paying nothing and have made big profits on the back of the pandemic. But also we need to look at things like saving people from the cliff edge of furlough stopping in September, giving more support to small businesses and the self-employed, and also keeping the £20 universal credit uplift. So these are the sort of things that the SNP would like to see in the Queen's speech. Let's talk about equality. More action. There
are lots of points there from both of you, and we'll have some time to pick up on some of them. Where will you be standing? Where will Labour be standing on this notion of what the government says is a radical extension of opportunity for people to pursue education and to pursue, let's say, degrees or other courses, vocational courses, well into adulthood?
So the Labour Party is founded on the principles of equality and giving everyone a fair opportunity to fulfil their talents and contribute to the wider country and their communities. But for that equality to be meaningful, it has to be started with investment in early years. And so the last Labour government invested in Sure Start and children's centres, which unfortunately over the last 11 years have sustained many, many cuts. Now that's undermined some of the language, which I do applaud what Gillian's saying about giving opportunities to people, but unfortunately we don't start from where we should be starting. 11 years of successive cuts to schools, to colleges. My local further education college in Bristol tells me of problems that are really quite difficult and intractable. If we're going to solve what's been referred to as inequality problem, I think we need to recognise some of the damage that's been done over the last 10 years and think about reinvesting in those early years centres, in those children's centres, as well as making sure that our schools are able to do the job that they are very skilled at doing. Otherwise, we then get to 18, 19, 20 with problems that could have been fixed earlier.
OK, thank you very much for setting out some themes, which we can explore a little more as the programme goes on. Maybe the best thing now is to take our bearings rather quickly within the Palace of Westminster. It's sometimes difficult to know exactly where we are in the Palace when we see the events taking place. Lots of refurbishment work going on. I mentioned it right at the start of the programme. It's pretty much everywhere. The evidence especially visible outside, where the Queen Elizabeth Tower, over there on the left, just by Westminster Bridge, that's the tower which houses Big Ben. It's been shrouded in scaffolding for months. Now, this entire refurbishment project, and you can see it in extensive parts of the palace, estimated to cost at least £12 billion by the time it's completed, and clearly it's a rather controversial plan because of the cost, but we're talking really about a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so those who are saying that, the cost is very high, but actually on a building like this, you have to spend the money. That's the heart of the debate for you. Now, the Queen will be using that Sovereign's entrance just down there under the other tower, to the right-hand side, the Victoria Tower, the base of the Victoria Tower, which houses the Parliamentary Archive. Now, the royal staircase, there it is, rather empty today, but it's normally lined by the Household Cavalry. Sadly, they're not with us today. Maybe they're watching at home. The Queen will be making her way to the robing room. That's the room directly opposite us now, past these busts of former Prime Ministers who were members of the House of Lords. And inside that robing room, that's where the Imperial State Crown will be placed on a cushion, ready for the procession. Her Majesty is not wearing the crown today. She's not wearing the parliamentary robes today. It is scaled back in all kinds of forms. And then the procession will lead through here. Now, this is one of my favourite parts of the palace, really. It's the Royal Gallery. It's one of the royal sections of the Palace of Westminster. And here you'll have 17 peers and 17 lucky MPs sitting on either side with a great view of the procession. They're lucky because they've all been chosen by ballot. There was a bit of a competition for these places. At the far end of the Royal Gallery, there's that little room called the Prince's Chamber. And around the Prince's Chamber, you can spend hours in here just looking at these remarkable portraits of the Tudors, all the wives of Henry VIII, and you have Elizabeth I and all kinds of Tudors in there. And then the room itself is dominated by this enormous white marble statue of Queen Victoria. So under the steely gaze of Queen Victoria, the procession will go into the chamber of the House of Lords, and then Her Majesty will deliver the speech from the throne, which was built in 1847 by John Webb of Bond Street to the design of Pugin. I mentioned a second throne. Well, it was installed in 1901 for the consort. It's been placed now in the care of the Lord Great Chamberlain, so it's in safekeeping. And the Lord Great Chamberlain is the one who will give the signal to summon members of Parliament from the other end of the Palace of Westminster to come to listen to the speech. And they'll pass through this space at the heart of the palace. This is the central hub, if you like. It's the central lobby, which connects the two chambers, the elected Commons, the unelected Lords, and my colleague Rita Chakrabarti is keeping an eye on things there.
Huw, it's a very different atmosphere in Central Lobby this year. It's much more muted, much more low-key. There are few MPs, there are no members of the public, but some things will stay the same. Very shortly, we will see the Speaker's procession pass behind me into the chamber of the House of Commons, and we'll hear the familiar cry of "hats off, strangers," although this year that will have a different ring to it because there are no strangers, members of the public. Shortly after that, we will see Black Rod coming from the House of Lords into the House of Commons to request that MPs come to hear the Queen. And as is traditional, she will have the door slammed in her face. That is the traditional assertion of the independence of the House of Commons. Well, we've been speaking to the person who is responsible for shutting that door. That's the Sergeant-at-Arms, Ugbana Oyet, and also to someone else with a key role in today's ceremony. That's the new Lord Speaker, Lord McFall.
I joined Parliament in 2012 as the lead electrical engineer. In 2019, I became Sergeant-at-Arms at the House of Commons. What most people are familiar with is the public role of the Sergeant-at-Arms, which is seen especially on large state ceremonial events. But behind the scenes, I'm working with Black Rod and the security department to maintain security of the estate and also for maintaining order.
I was a Labour MP for 23 years before coming into the House of Lords in 2010, and I am the newly elected Speaker of the House of Lords. I represent all members of the House of Lords at the state opening, and every member takes this visit to the Queen very, very seriously. My role will be ceremonial, but there are not many people who, on their first day in a new job, have the opportunity to welcome Her Majesty the Queen. So it's a very welcome occasion for me.
COVID has had a huge impact on our work. This year in state opening, we've had to mark, measure, and check every location and every spot to ensure we remain COVID secure throughout the proceedings.
It will be a pared-down situation here with a limited number of members, but the respect and the tradition for the state opening of Parliament will continue.
Slamming the door really dates back to the Civil War, and it's about the independence of the House of Commons from the monarch. Blackrod comes to the Commons as the representative of the monarch, and we slam the door to show they have no right, they have no power, and they have no authority here. One year, we forgot to take out the glass in the door, and of course, when Blackrod knocked on the door, the glass was smashed. So each year, we put a big note, remember to remove the glass.
The state opening is a very important place in the Constitution, and it reminds us of our tradition and our history.
For me, it's really special. It's a great part of the role.
It's a very big day for me personally, but also for the House itself and the country.
Well, I'm joined now here in Central Lobby by Sarah Olney, who is the Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park and also the party's spokeswoman on transport and business, energy and industry strategy. Sarah, you've attended a state opening of Parliament before. This must feel very different this time.
Well, it really does. And I think, you know, the nice thing about state opening of Parliament is obviously a ritual, and it's that sense of continuity, but also togetherness when the Commons and the Lords come together. So it does feel very different this year that we can't all be together, but nevertheless really important that it is still taking place in the way that it always has done. And I think, you know, as much of a spectacle as always, and as much that sense of tradition as always, even if it can't be quite the same.
We've yet to hear the speech, but we have some sense of the priorities that the government wants to put forward, the levelling up agenda, an increase in skills, a reform of the planning laws. What do you feel about the agenda?
Well, obviously we very much welcome the news on skills. It's something that Liberal Democrats have been campaigning for some time, central to our 2019 manifesto. But I do think that the planning white paper is going to meet a lot of resistance amongst communities of all sorts. It's very much taking planning controls and decisions away from local communities, and that's absolutely not what people want. And I mean, you know, Boris Johnson spent all last week talking about delivering on the people's priorities, and yet what we see is plans to bring in voter ID and the scrapping of the Fixed-Term Parliament Act. That's absolutely not what I was hearing on the doorstep of the people's priorities right now.
I was going to ask you about the Fixed-Term Parliament Act, because that was brought in 10 years ago when the Liberal Democrats were in coalition government. Do you think that that shouldn't be a priority?
I don't think it should be abolished at all. Absolutely not a priority. I think it's really, really important that Parliament has a say as to when general elections are called, and that it's not just in the gift of the government or the Prime Minister to call it at a time that's convenient to them. And I think this is absolutely a case of Boris Johnson just wanting to bring more power back to the government and take it away from Parliament, and we resist that very much.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Sarah Olney there, MP for Richmond Park. And with that, it's back to you, Huw.
Rita, many thanks. That's Rita there in the central lobby, and we'll be back with Rita a little later on. Just to give you a sense of timings here, because it's now just coming up to 5 to 11. So we'll begin to see some of the elements of the ceremony that we have today taking place. We've seen the Yeomen of the Guard already. We'll see the Gentlemen at Arms, who are another royal bodyguard. We'll see the crown, for example, the imperial state crown being brought from Buckingham Palace to the Palace of Westminster. So all of that coming up in the next few minutes before we lead up to just before 11:30 when Her Majesty will arrive. Laura, we heard quite a few themes from our friends here just in the opening statements. Do you detect that this forthcoming session, given the government's very solid majority, is going to be anything as politically charged and controversial as the ones we've seen in the last few years?
I think it's going to be extremely different, no question about that. I mean, the last time we sat here with a Queen's speech, it was the moment just after the general election, following an extraordinary period of sort of angst and tension when the government majority was sort of whittled away. 2 prime ministers have been ousted by disputes inside the Conservative Party. This is going to be extremely different. And the pandemic has sort of put such a freeze on any kind of business as usual around here. I don't think that any of our guests or any politicians or any of viewers really, I don't think any of us here have a sense of what a political atmosphere when a government has a huge majority in this place will feel like. And I think that really will change the terms of political debate, no question about that. But it's also fascinating and I think really important to remember that while we'll hear today from ministers after Her Majesty's speech about the things that they really want to do, the problems that they really want to fix, the political conjuring trick, if you like, that the Conservatives have been able to pull off in the last decade is that they've been in charge all through this time. But now we have a Prime Minister who was elected with a huge majority who basically presents his government as if it's a new broom and it's all different, and somehow none of the things that have happened in the last decade were down to their own party, which is a really fascinating political tension here.
That's got to be a challenge for the opposition now, isn't it, really? Because as Laura's saying, if a government is able to present itself, or a Prime Minister, as a new broom, as a new government, even though the party's been in power for all that time, that's where the task is for Labour to say, well, hang on a second, you know, you mustn't be drawn into that narrative because we do have a party that's been in power for a long time. And if they wanted to do all of these very important things that they say they want to do today, they've had 11 years already to do some of them. So isn't that the point?
Well, I think you heard that from me in the opening remarks earlier, which is that I think it's a bit rich to hear a government saying they want to level up equality when over the last 11 years they've done the exact opposite. And it will be my job as Shadow Leader of the House and my colleagues in Shadow Cabinet to keep on exposing that as constructively and as often as possible, but also to offer an alternative. And I think that's really important, that an opposition opposes. That is our constitutional duty. We're required, the clue's in the name. But we also have to oppose by offering a different vision, and one that actually gives hope and aspiration to the British people, that it echoes what they want for their children and their grandchildren, and that we show also that it's possible. Because the issue for any opposition is set out that vision, but also show credibly how you can achieve it. The government, of course, they set the agenda. Our job is to expose some of the holes in that agenda.
Minister, do you think that, you know, it is a matter of trying to establish continuity, or is there a great advantage in being able to say, well, you know, this is a Prime Minister who did get his own huge majority last time, and in effect, as you want voters to look at it, it's a new start. And, you know, you're then open to the accusation that as a party, not Prime Minister, but as a party, you've not done some of the things which you could have done long before now.
Well, I think, to me, it definitely feels like a new start. I mean, I only came in 2017, so for 7 years of the period you're talking about, I was working in a different country, actually, so doing something completely different. And a lot of the 2019 intake are completely different. I mean, they're very much from the working class north, they're from those red wall that became Tory seats. And, you know, there has been a complete change, actually. It feels like there's a change in the party. And, of course, the majority makes a massive difference. You know, at the beginning of that period, there was a coalition, and of course we had to recover from the financial crash. So, you know, there's been different things that have had to be done at those times. I think there's been a lot of effort over the years when we talk about education on improving our school system. And, you know, there are now many more kids that go to good or outstanding schools than ever have before. So a lot of work has been done. There's also been a lot of work on access to university. 50% of young people go to university now. When I left school, it was less than 10%. There's been a lot of change over the last intervening decades. So what we're talking about now is the bit that hasn't been done. And many people have spoken about doing it. I must say, I was looking at something the other day and somebody asked me, when was the first time this was spoken about? It was 1884, when William Gladstone was a Prime Minister. And this the same with a lot of things in politics. There's not really that many original ideas. What's really original is having the ability to deliver it and the timing being right to deliver it. One of the most important things when I look at my job, apprenticeships and skills, 80% of the workforce are in work today. That will be the workforce for 2030. 2030, when we've got lots of ambitious green targets as part of our net zero, lots of things are changing in the workplace. 80% of people are there already. So these are the challenges, which are the challenges of the time. They wouldn't have been the right challenge for somebody to start working on in 2010. Possibly that wouldn't have been the priority. Now's the timing, and timing's everything. And I think that's why we're going to make this massive difference and deliver on this promise.
The scene at Buckingham Palace. Now we have the first set of vehicles leaving, and this is going to be the cars bringing the regalia. So there you have the unmistakable features of the imperial state crown in the first car, and then we'll have the other elements of regalia known as the sword of state, there it is, and the cap of maintenance. We just caught sight of that too. So this is an escort, if you like, for the regalia. And you might ask, well, why is this an escort? What does this reflect? Well, it reflects the fact that these are the emblems of sovereignty. The imperial state crown, certainly, which we'll see close up when it gets to the Palace of Westminster, is only seen at a coronation or at the state opening of Parliament. It is probably the most prominent symbol of the monarch's sovereignty and power. And to bring that crown into Parliament is, in a way, it's an illustration, if you like, of the way that this kind of constitution that operates really is functioning, which is the crown in Parliament. It is known as the crown in Parliament. In other words, the executive and Parliament and the monarchy in a kind of three-way equation. So the regalia are on their way, and they'll arrive within a few minutes, and then in a short while Her Majesty the Queen will be leaving Buckingham Palace for this state opening. I believe it's her 67th state opening of the reign. So as that happens, let's join Rita once again.
I'm joined now by Baroness Jones of Moulsecoomb of the Green Party. Good morning to you, Jenny. We know that the Queen's speech is going to contain an environment bill with targets set for environmental advances. You must welcome that.
I do welcome that. I mean, we've seen the bill before. I hope it's better than last time. And I hope there's enough funding as well and really serious targets. But the rest of the statement that the Queen is going to say today, I am concerned that there seems to be a lot about issues and measures that can actually keep our government in for many more decades, which is not good for voters, of course. But, for example, the voter ID, the changes to judicial review, and, of course, the policing bill, which is incredibly repressive and will stop protests.
These are not designed, though, to keep the government in power. They're designed, for example, with voter ID to prevent fraud.
Well, there's no fraud. I mean, this is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. If the amount of fraud is tiny. No, I think the government is very clear that they'd want less and less opposition. And I'm afraid at the moment, the House of Lords is the only place they're finding much opposition.
There are other aspects to the Queen's speech that we're expecting, of course, the levelling up agenda, an increase in skills, a reform of the planning laws. What do you think about those?
I'm concerned about the planning laws because what we're already seeing is quite a lot of disregard for environmental and ecological measures in those. So let's see exactly what's in there before we start to comment. But I basically think this government is probably not on the side of Greens and the environment.
We're just out of local elections in England, national elections in Scotland and Wales. The Greens had a good night in Scotland, and you made advances in England as well. But your representation here in Westminster is very small. How do you make your voices heard?
Well, I think the interesting thing for us during that election campaign, and I stayed glued to the television throughout the last day, was that we took seats from Tories and from Labour. And that suggests that our appeal has got broader and that people are understanding as well that when we get elected, we do what we say, we actually stick to our manifesto. We've got some amazing local candidates, and I think we're going to hear a lot more from them.
Very good to talk to you. Thank you so much. That is Jenny Jones, Baroness Jenny Jones of Moulsecoomb for the Green Party. Back to you, Huw.
Rita, many thanks. Here's the scene on Whitehall just passing the gates of Downing Street there on the left and past the Foreign Office and the Treasury, past the Cenotaph. So this is the crown that is being delivered to the Palace of Westminster first of all, the sword of state and the cap of maintenance. All of these emblems of the monarch's authority will be there in readiness for the Queen's arrival in a few minutes' time. They're just approaching Parliament Square now, just passing the corner there which leads up to the River Thames. They'll cross here past the statue of David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, and then we'll see them turning into the precincts of the Palace of Westminster in one of the Royal Rolls Royces, one of the state cars. The controller of the Lord Chamberlain's office from Buckingham Palace, who's looking after the imperial state crown on its journey, down past the Church of St. Margaret's, Westminster, and past the St. Stephen's entrance. There it is, the crown, which is really the most famous symbol of the sovereign's power, with its 3,000 jewels and precious stones. And past Westminster Abbey there on the left-hand side, the Henry VII Chapel, and turning into the sovereign's entrance on a dry, rather cloudy day here in central London, and then through the main gates, where we will see the Queen arriving in a short while. The Crown Jeweller will be part of this sequence of events to make sure that the crown itself is taken out and handled carefully. Safely retrieved. Transferred safely. The crown is taken up the royal staircase, and they will wait there for the other insignia. The cap of maintenance there, which is trimmed with ermine, crimson velvet. That is the cap that is the reminder of those monarchs being favoured by the Pope all those years ago. And the Pope would give a cap to those monarchs who were in his favour at the time. And then the sword of state, dating back to the reign of James II. Another element of the sovereign's authority. All of them brought into the Houses of Parliament for a purpose, a very visible purpose, to remind all those present and all those watching of the monarch's authority in reading that Queen's speech in the House of Lords. Very different scene to previous years, because normally there would be a dismounted detachment of the Household Cavalry from the Blues and Royals and the Life Guards lining the staircase, lots of them young recruits. They're no longer with us because of the restrictions. Hopefully they'll be back before long. And there you have the most spectacular image of the crown itself. The crown worn by the Queen in 1953 on her coronation day, and taken into the Royal Gallery, past the yeomen of the guard who are standing there, ready to accompany it. And it'll be taken into the robing room, just at the far end. You can see the two state trumpeters either side of the doorway. They will be sounding the fanfare when the Queen is ready to process to the House of Lords a little later on. The Yeoman Place. And unlike the crown, these emblems will be placed on display in the Royal Gallery. And they're being placed on display for a very particular purpose, and that is just to remind people of the sovereign's power. And they will be carried in the procession when the Queen, Prince of Wales, make their way from the robing room into the House of Lords a little later on. I mentioned the Prince of Wales. Well, here we have Clarence House, just off St James's Park in central London, and this is the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall making their way. The first of the processions, and these are all members of the main procession, which will take place a little later on. They're all gathering at the top of the royal staircase, ready for the Queen's arrival. So that's what we're now seeing, is all of these groups assembling, ready for the Queen's arrival just before 11:30. And here we have Black Rod. Black Rod will be summoning the MPs a little later on. And Garter, King of Arms, Thomas Woodcock, in his last state opening of Parliament, in charge of all the heraldic guidelines, advises the Queen on those. And then Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's Lord President of the Council and Leader of the House of Commons. The latest group. And they will go down the staircase ready to greet the Queen when she arrives. Then we have the 17 peers and MPs lining the Royal Gallery. And this is the unmistakable expanse of Horse Guards parade, I think. This is the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall making their way towards the Horse Guards Arch and down onto Whitehall. The new Lord Speaker, John McFall, Lord McFall, who was a former Labour MP for Dumbarton, very well known in the Commons, especially during the financial crisis, because he chaired the Treasury Select Committee at that time and grilled lots of the bankers who were involved in the controversies of the time. So Lord McFall recently elected to succeed Lord Fowler as Lord Speaker. He presides over sessions of the House of Lords. He's also actually nominally in charge of security and other arrangements for the House of Lords as well. But he is the ultimate authority on events in the House of Lords. Lord McFall will be in place. It's his first state opening, and he's ready for Her Majesty's arrival. The Lord High Chancellor. This is Robert Buckland QC. I think I'm allowed to say that he is the second Lord High Chancellor to come from the Welsh town of Llanelli. The first was Lord Elwyn Jones, who served under Harold Wilson and James Callaghan back in the 70s. Robert Buckland, from a well-known legal family in my part of Wales. He's the MP for Swindon South, and he's in his post and will be part of the procession itself again for the state opening. A view once again of the royal staircase, and the Lord High Chancellor has arrived. And this is the scene outside. Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall being brought to the Palace of Westminster, and they are pretty much on time. just passing Parliament Square and approaching the palace itself. And if we cross central London and if we go across St James's Park and Green Park, this wonderfully green and beautiful part of central London, we can see Buckingham Palace once again. Approaching the Sovereign's entrance. And in they go, ready for the procession a little later. The Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall will be present in the chamber. They'll be taking their places on those state chairs as the Queen delivers the speech on the throne. Being welcomed by the Marquess of Cholmondeley, Lord Chamberlain, who's in charge of the royal parts of the Palace of Westminster, including Westminster Hall and the Royal Gallery and the robing room. And exchanging a few words with the Garter King of Arms. Prince of Wales no doubt aware that it's the last state opening for Thomas Woodcock, who's been in post for several years. And there you have the scene from inside the Royal Gallery. And if we take a look inside the House of Lords, where most of those who've secured places are now in place, and a range of people. There's Lord Forsyth, that's Michael Forsyth, who was Scottish Secretary under John Major. Angela Smith, the former Labour Minister. And we have Lord Newby there, the Lib Dem leader in the Lords. He's in place representing his party. And while the peers wait, the MPs and other peers are waiting next door, well, just about next door, in the Royal Gallery itself. On either side, 17 peers and 17 members of Parliament who, unlike the peers in the chamber, who are there for specific reasons, these have been competitive. They put their names into a ballot. So I'm just thinking, Laura, at this point, it's interesting to note from the selection of people there who was keen to come. They include, for example, Lord Lamont, who's there, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer. They include Lord Hannan, Daniel Hannan, the former MEP, and a range of people from the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And I think it's fair to say that after us, given the fact that we can see everything from here, they've not got a bad view, have they, really? It's not too bad, yeah.
I think they probably have the best view in the House, and especially, actually, because there's so few people there this year. Yeah. Normally, for our viewers, we can, remind them that this place is absolutely packed during a normal state opening. You can hardly sort of get a seat. Every single nook and cranny is packed everywhere, not least because quite often the female guests are wearing enormous hats. So if there's the wrong person sitting in front of you, you might not be able to see anything at all. Yeah. But how strange it is, though, also to see it like that. It is strange. Quite eerie, in a sense.
Joanna, can I ask you a rather pointed question about this whole business of being at a state opening in the presence of the Queen? And here you are, a long-standing, prominent member of the Scottish National Party, campaigning for independence. Are you able to appreciate the pageantry, even if you disagree with the underlying principles here?
Absolutely, and I'm half Irish, and many of my Irish relatives will be enjoying the pageantry today. And of course, the union of the crowns is quite separate from the union of the parliaments. The big issue in Scotland at the moment is whether the union of the parliaments should continue. And of course, my party has just received a resounding mandate on the back of a manifesto to hold a second independence referendum. And so in this Queen's speech today, I would like to see some recognition from the Conservative government that Scotland has two governments, and Scotland has a government in Edinburgh that has been re-elected for the 4th time in a row with an unprecedented mandate from the people to do things very differently from the way Boris Johnson wants to do things, and also, crucially, to hold a second independence referendum. And so I would like to see this government, if they are making a new start, as Gillian says, to make a new start in relation to Edinburgh, and to respect the Scottish Government and to treat this as the partnership of equals it was designed to be when the union of the parliaments took place in 1707.
Back at Buckingham Palace, we have Her Majesty the Queen leaving in a vehicle that we don't often see the Queen using, I think it's fair to say, on days like this. But it is a set of special circumstances governing today's event. I think it's also fair to say that. So passing the Queen Victoria Memorial on this very familiar ceremonial route along the Mall, and just passing Green Park on one side and now flanking St James's Park on the other. And I think they'll probably follow the same route, which is along the Mall, down the approach road onto Horse Guards Parade, where normally, of course, we have the Queen's birthday parade in June and Trooping the Colour. That took place in Windsor last year, very scaled back event, nonetheless successful. So through Horse Guards and that arch, and then down into the area around Whitehall. The Queen, of course, who celebrated her 95th birthday just 3 weeks ago on the 21st of April. And by our calculation, it is the 67th state opening of the Queen's reign. And when you put it in those terms, it really does stop you in your tracks, doesn't it, really, to think about the span of the reign, to think about what the Queen has seen in her lifetime, to think about the changes that she's seen in her lifetime, not just in the UK, momentous changes here, but around the world, and not just in terms of politics and how society functions, but in terms of science and medicine and technology too. So it really is a span of decades that's seen the world change fundamentally. And here she is, Her Majesty, once again undertaking her duty. Her sense of duty, of course, is unshakable. And on her way to Horse Guards, past the Guards Memorial there, on the right-hand side of the cavalcade, and ready to cross the expanse of Horse Guards. And they'll be down at Parliament within a few minutes' time. Back in Central Lobby, the inspector, ready to tell strangers to take their hats off, in other words, non-members, to show respect for the Speaker. Waiting for the signal. Speaker's procession happens every day that the Commons is in session. This same procedure.
Hats off, strangers!
Very familiar scene for those who watch the state opening, but for all of those visitors who come to the Houses of Parliament. The Sergeant-at-Arms leading the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the MP for Chorley, originally elected as a Labour MP, but now, of course, not a party-aligned MP as Speaker. Sir Lindsay, whose father was a Labour MP before him, Doug Hoyle, who's now a member of the House of Lords. So the announcements of the speakers on the way, down towards the members' lobby of the House of Commons, preceded by the Sergeant-at-Arms. We heard from him a little while ago, past Churchill on the left and Lloyd George on the right, and into the chamber where there will be prayers, and that will signal the closing of the doors. And here's the Queen arriving in the Palace of Westminster at the Sovereign's entrance. We have the Victoria Tower and the Victoria Gardens there on the banks of the River Thames, with the Union flag flying, soon to be replaced by the Royal Standard, which is the sign that the Queen has arrived in the Palace of Westminster. And there we have the Royal Standard flying in the breeze and the Union flag being taken down. And as soon as the Queen leaves a little later, we'll have the reverse of that process. So the Royal Standard now signalling to anyone who's passing in London, and indeed to the rest of the country if they're watching these pictures, that the Queen is at the Palace of Westminster and is ready for the state opening of 2021. The London Eye just in the background there on the left, and the old County Hall, St Thomas's Hospital across the river from the Houses of Parliament, and a good image there of Big Ben shrouded in that scaffolding. The Garter King of Arms, normally leading the heralds, and Her Majesty having made her way up to the robing room with the Marquis of Cholmondeley. Inside the Royal Gallery, those taking part in the procession, including the Lord Speaker and the Lord High Chancellor, will now start to form up, along with Black Rod, ready for this to take place. And the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl Marshal, who's in charge of all great state events involving state openings, or indeed coronations and funerals. One of the great offices of state. The state trumpeters in place, ready to sound the fanfare. So a shorter wait probably than usual, because the Queen will not be wearing the state robes or the crown. So just a few last-minute conversations before the procession is underway. And as Laura was saying earlier, those present in the Royal Gallery will have the best view of the day, I suspect, because they will be within a few feet of Her Majesty as she makes her way down to the House of Lords, Prince of Wales too, and the Duchess of Cornwall. We have representatives here of the armed forces, of the royal households, and of course the great offices reflecting the tradition of the royal family and the great royal palaces going back over centuries. And on either side of the door, rather poignantly on the left, a great portrait of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, whose funeral took place just a few weeks ago. And that funeral indeed was the last major public engagement undertaken by the Queen before today. The Queen's portrait just on the right-hand side. And then as the trumpeters are ready to sound the fanfare, above the trumpeters we also have a portrait of King George VI, the Queen's father, who died at a young age. And of course that meant that the Queen ascended the throne at a very young age. Magnificent portraits of the battles of Waterloo and Trafalgar, which line the walls of the Royal Gallery. And the procession is about to get underway. So this state opening of Parliament of May 2021 gets underway with the Prince of Wales accompanying Her Majesty the Queen in procession behind the imperial state crown, which is the great symbol of the Queen's authority. Duchess of Cornwall just following behind the Prince and Her Majesty. The Queen will enter the House of Lords, and in a pattern that is now extremely familiar to Her Majesty, given that this is her 67th state opening, having passed the statue of Queen Victoria, enter the Lords and will take her place on the great throne. And will then give the signal for the House of Commons to be summoned. Crown being brought into the House of Lords, everyone stands. And they will await the Queen's signal.
My Lords, pray be seated.
Signal has been given, and it's been received in the central lobby. And Blackrod on her way to summon the MPs. The monarch's representative, and in the tradition, will have to knock on the door of the House of Commons. A reminder of the days when the monarch tried to arrest some members of Parliament.
Close the door! It's Blackrod. Open the door. Blackrod!
Mr. Speaker, the Queen commands this House of Peers.
A few words lost there, but we are familiar, of course, with the words of Blackrod to attend Her Majesty in the House of Peers. In other words, they are summoned. Sergeant-at-Arms and Blackrod leading the way, and there we have the Prime Minister on the left-hand side on the government benches. The Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, part of this rather small group of MPs making their way today. Prime Minister followed by Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. And there we have Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, Ian Blackford for the Scottish National Party. And I'll just bring Laura in here, because normally, Laura, of course, the Prime Minister and opposition leader would be chatting and walking together.
They would.
So this is a very different setup.
It's a very different setup. Well, they would be walking together, but sometimes actually not chatting, which was always also rather interesting when you saw the level of tensions between the main opposition and the governing party. But just watching Boris Johnson there with Keir Starmer several paces behind, both of them, of course, in the last few days, dealing with the aftermath of a huge set of election results from right across the country, the Conservatives having huge success in much of England, the Labour Party having a very difficult time, But that's not to say that the government is also free of headaches. You know, that constitutional argument that we've already been referring to is very much also on the government's mind. But also just interesting to see the new Labour Chief Whip there, Alan Campbell, in his place, with the veteran Chief Whip Nick Brown having been removed as part of this reshuffle, and Labour's turmoil in recent days also surely must be on Keir Starmer's mind.
So the social distancing very much in evidence. They'd normally be crowded into that central place.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, my government's priority is to deliver a national recovery from the pandemic that makes the United Kingdom stronger, healthier, and more prosperous than before. To achieve this, my government will level up opportunities across all parts of the United Kingdom, supporting jobs, businesses, and economic growth, and addressing the impact of the pandemic on public services. My government will protect the health of the nation, continuing the vaccination programme and providing additional funding to support the NHS. My ministers will bring forward legislation to empower the NHS to innovate and embrace technology. Patients will receive more tailored and preventative care closer to home. Measures will be brought forward to support the health and well-being of the nation, including to tackle obesity and improve mental health. Proposals on social care reform will be brought forward. My government will build on the success of the vaccination programme to lead the world in life sciences, pioneering new treatments against diseases like cancer, and securing jobs and investment across the country. My ministers will oversee the fastest ever increase in public funding for research and development and pass legislation to establish an advanced research agency. Following the unprecedented support provided to businesses during the pandemic, proposals will be brought forward to create and support jobs and improve regulation. My government will strengthen the economic ties across the Union, investing in and improving national infrastructure. Proposals will be taken forward to transform connectivity by rail and bus, and to extend 5G mobile coverage and gigabit-capable broadband. Legislation will support a lifetime skills guarantee to enable flexible access to high-quality education and training throughout people's lives. Measures will be introduced to ensure that support for businesses reflects the United Kingdom's strategic interests and drives economic growth. Laws will simplify procurement in the public sector. 8 new free ports will create hubs for trade and help regenerate communities. My government will ensure that the public finances are returned to a sustainable path once the economic recovery is secure. Measures will be brought forward to ensure that children have the best start in life, prioritizing their early years. My ministers will address lost learning during the pandemic and ensure every child has a high-quality education and is able to fulfill their potential. My government will help more people to own their own home while enhancing the rights of those who rent. Laws to modernize the planning system so that more homes can be built will be brought forward, along with measures to end the practice of ground rents for new leasehold properties. My ministers will establish in law a new building safety regulator to ensure that the tragedies of the past are never repeated. Measures will be brought forward to address racial and ethnic disparities and ban conversion therapy. Legislation will support the voluntary sector by reducing unnecessary bureaucracy and releasing additional funds for good causes. My government will invest in new green industries to create jobs while protecting the environment. The United Kingdom is committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and will continue to lead the way internationally by hosting the COP26 summit in Glasgow. Legislation will set binding environmental targets. Legislation will also be brought forward to ensure the United Kingdom has and promotes the highest standards of animal welfare. My government will strengthen and renew democracy and the Constitution. Legislation will be introduced to ensure the integrity of elections, protect freedom of speech, and restore the balance of power between the executive, legislature, and the courts. My ministers will promote the strength and integrity of the Union. Measures will be brought forward to strengthen devolved government in Northern Ireland and address the legacy of the past. My government will introduce measures to increase the safety and security of its citizens. Legislation will increase sentences for the most serious and violent offenders and ensure the timely administration of justice. Proposals will be brought forward to address violence, including against women and girls, and to support victims. Measures will be brought forward to establish a fairer immigration system that strengthens the United Kingdom's borders and deters criminals who facilitate dangerous and illegal journeys. My government will lead the way in ensuring internet safety for all, especially for children, whilst harnessing the benefits of a free, open, and secure internet. My ministers will provide our gallant armed services with the biggest spending increase in 30 years, taking forward their programme of modernisation and reinforcing the United Kingdom's commitment to NATO. My ministers will honour and strengthen the Armed Forces Covenant, placing it in law. Measures will be introduced to provide national insurance contribution relief for employers of veterans. Legislation will be introduced to counter hostile activity by foreign states. My ministers will implement the integrated review of security, defence, development, and foreign policy. The United Kingdom will host the G7 summit and lead the global effort to secure a robust economic recovery from the pandemic. My ministers will deepen trade ties in the Gulf, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific. My government will continue to provide aid where it has the greatest impact on reducing poverty and alleviating human suffering. My government will uphold human rights and democracy across the world. It will take forward a global effort to get 40 million girls across the world into school. Members of the House of Commons, estimates for the public services will be laid before you. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, other measures will be laid before you. I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils.
The Lord High Chancellor acknowledges that the Queen has ended the reading of the Queen's speech, and the Marquis of Cholmondeley brings back the imperial state crown for the procession through the Prince's Gallery and back to the Royal Gallery and to the robing room. Relatively brief in terms of duration, as the Queen's speech usually is, but that touched a lot of themes, and there were some brief sentences there which actually were references to major pieces of legislation, or certainly major potential areas for legislation, which we'll discuss in a moment. Peers are on their feet as the Queen leaves, and the procession, led by the Crown, through the Prince's chamber and back into the Royal Gallery itself. Prince of Wales escorting his mother, Her Majesty the Queen. They're followed by the Duchess of Cornwall. Crown which will be returned to the Tower of London. As will the other regalia that we saw earlier, the Sword of State and the Cap of Maintenance. The Queen looking carefully around the Royal Gallery and no doubt reflecting on the fact that it is not full of 600 diplomatic guests and representatives of the armed forces and peers guests as it normally is. It's a very, very different sight and a very different feel. And here we have the members returning. That's Sir Geoffrey Donaldson there from the Unionists of Northern Ireland, as one of the small band of MPs who made their way. Sir Ed Davey for the Lib Dems, Ian Blackford for the SNP, and in they come back into the chamber. The chamber, of course, in the next few days will be dealing with the content of the Queen's speech. There will be a debate. Prime Minister, having just nipped out past the Speaker's chair, back to where the Prime Minister's suite of offices lies, just behind there in the corridors behind the chair, and no doubt reflecting on a rather brief ceremonial event today. But I have to say, Laura, and I'll come to our guests as well, you know, I marked several things, and we won't have time to discuss all of them, but just a couple of things that I wanted to pick up. My government will strengthen and renew democracy and the Constitution. Renew democracy, which is quite a big idea, and the Constitution, and legislation will be introduced to ensure the integrity of elections. Now, does that refer to ID?
I think it refers to two things. First of all, and the Conservative manifesto said that there would be a review of judicial reviews, essentially looking at whether the balance between people taking things to court that might bleed into the political arena and what actually happens in this place now during the Brexit debate. And Joanna was very much part of some of those legal efforts. We all remember the tensions between those court cases at the Supreme Court and what then happened here in Parliament. So the Conservatives want to take a look at that. But the second point, as you talked to, is this question of voter ID and whether or not voters would have to register to vote. The government wants to push ahead with that. The opposition has concerns.
In a few moments, I think we'll see Her Majesty the Queen leaving that robing room and going back downstairs to the royal cars to go back to Buckingham Palace and no doubt back to Windsor if the past few months are anything to go by, because that's where she's spent most of the last year. Lots of it, of course, shielding with the Duke of Edinburgh. They were at Windsor together during the pandemic. So one suspects that that is what's going to happen indeed. But it is remarkable when you think that the Queen there reading the contents of yet another speech. She's read so many, at least 67 of them. But she's 95, she just celebrated her 95th birthday, and just appeared with all the usual authority and grace, and really thought it was just something to reflect on when you think what the Queen's been through over the last few months. You know, people watching, I think it's just worth reflecting, Laura, people watching will be thinking, well, that is someone who knows what duty is.
And it's a remarkable feat, isn't it? And I think that's always what part of today's ceremony is about, actually, continuity. And that actual tension between the continuity of the monarchy and then very often, particularly in the last few years, the real turbulence that you can have politically. And, you know, with the Duke of Edinburgh's passing recently, we checked at that point, through his lifetime, he had lived through 20 prime ministers. Now, that's quite something when you think about it. You know, I think he was born when Lord George was in Downing Street. And so for the Queen too, not just to have been here making the speeches on so many occasions, but in terms of that span of lifetime, all the enormous political changes
remarkable.
Lived
and when
through.
you think that, I think this is Prime Minister number 14 for the Queen. So again, it's just something that, especially for younger viewers, you know, who think that Tony Blair is prehistory, doesn't apply to us, I'm afraid. Well, maybe not all of us. You know, when you think of the fact that the Queen was, you know, came to the throne when Winston Churchill was number 10, it is a remarkable thing. And here she is today at the age of 95. You know, unveiling yet another programme of legislation. So, Laura, you mentioned renewing democracy. I'm coming back to it because I think it's actually something that will cause a bit of debate. And I did mention ID. On the way here today, I happened to note that lots of activity on social media was to do with, hang on a second, we can't be compelled to buy some form of ID if that is the only way in which we can vote, because clearly we don't need to pay to vote. Now, how does this debate happen?
Well, what the government has been discussing and looking at, as I understand it, for some time, is whether or not there is a big enough concern around fraud in elections that there should be an additional measure when you turn up to put your cross on the ballot paper. So should there be some form of identification required there, as actually happens already in Northern Ireland? And what there has been a discussion around is some form of free identification. Nobody would be asked to pay, but some form of free identification in case people don't have a driver's licence or a passport, because of course not everybody does, particularly younger voters. And the government seems determined to push on with this plan. But there is controversy around it among the opposition parties, I'm sure we'll hear in a moment, that anything that could be a deterrent to voters, particularly in communities and age groups where voting isn't perhaps such a common habit, isn't something that's part of the sort of social expectation, anything that's a deterrent is therefore not what people who believe in this place and believe in access to democracy should be pursuing. But I have to say the government is intent on doing it. It's been a long discussion that has gone on, and there have been various, you know, reviews and considerations over the last few years about the extent of this problem or not problem. But it was interesting when Rita was talking to Baroness Jenny Jones, the Green leader in the House of Lords. She said, well, basically there isn't any fraud in her view, and therefore they're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. But there's quite a lot of strong words being thrown around here. Some people accusing the government of trying to sort of some form of voter suppression, which of course is something that, well, I'm sure the minister here would today, but Boris Johnson himself dismissed that yesterday as being complete nonsense.
Because people have been using the US example and saying, well, you know, this is a way of, if you're so inclined, it's a way of restricting people. Which I'm sure the minister, clearly that's not your stated intention, I know that, but do you have fears around it?
No, and I'm not sure that many people would. I mean, you know, if I go to collect a parcel at the post office now, I need to take my driving licence or my passport. Pretty much everything I do, I need to prove who I am. I personally think there's probably a case even for looking at, you know, having ID online, because we know that there's a lot of fraud online and we know that's affecting people as well.
We're just seeing the Prince of Wales and the Duchess leaving. Minister, sorry, for just a second. And they're using the staircase here to go down past the regalia room, which is the little room at the bottom there, where normally they hold on to the crown and the other regalia before they are put on display. So past that room and turning left, and then the cars will be there ready to take them back, in this case, to Clarence House. And there we have Lord Macfall just opposite us there, the new Lord Speaker, and the Lord High Chancellor, and the Prince of Wales exchanging a few words once again with the Garter King of Arms, Thomas Woodcock. The Duchess down to the Sovereign's entrance here, and the Marquess of Cholmondeley, who's just exchanging a few words with the Prince. And then we have the Duke of Norfolk here on the left-hand side, who's the Earl Marshal, who, as I said earlier, is in charge of great state events, including the state opening, but more particularly maybe coronations and investitures and great weddings and funerals too. So a few words with the Duke of Norfolk. The Earl Marshal is a hereditary role, centuries old in terms of the functions that the royal family shares out. So the Prince and the Duchess are leaving. And Minister, you were just saying that you think that forms of ID are now so much part of our life that they're pretty much unavoidable. But clearly there is that cost question. So what would you say to viewers on that?
Well, there won't be a cost. So either you use your driving licence or your passport, or you will go to your local authority and there will be another form of ID that you can get.
Right, because if you don't have a passport or a driving licence, you'd have to buy one of those. So there's another option again.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, if you think about it, I mean, you know, you have to register to vote, obviously. You get your card. And the only part of it is when you turn up, you just say who you are. You don't actually have to show who you are. So what it is just tightening that up so that somebody couldn't say there was somebody else taken, you know, the details, which could happen, by the way. If you look at systems and you're looking at designing a system, you can see a hole in that system. So what we're looking to do is improve that system. As I say, you have to do it for almost everything now to get a parcel or whatever. But it won't cost the voter anything.
Does Labour have concerns about this?
We have great concerns. I mean, Gillian's talking here about having to go and get another piece of proof. Now, voting isn't like collecting a parcel. It's a right. It's something which every citizen of this country should enjoy with a minimum number of obstacles. Putting more obstacles in people's way will discourage voting. It will be, in my view, discriminatory, or it could be. There's a risk that it will be discriminatory because we need to know at the moment how people are supposed to know about it, how to go and get that different form of ID, what processes would have to go through. Now, if this is a way of introducing ID cards through a different route, I think the government should be honest about it, and if it's not, there's a problem here.
Just a second, Dagam, just because we are seeing the last elements of the ceremony today. This is the last section of pageantry, if you like, because we're now seeing the crown and the sword and the cap being taken back to the Tower of London, and there we have the gentlemen at arms. I mentioned the Royal Bodyguard, the Yeoman of the Guard earlier, set up by Henry Tudor. Well, the gentlemen at arms created by Henry VIII in 1506, I think, though if I got that wrong, I'm sure there'll be very expert people telling me that within seconds on social media. I think it was 1506, but they're called the nearest guard because they are known as a more senior corps of royal bodyguards. So down the royal staircase, and they will soon be leaving. Thangam, you were saying that you do have big concerns about this ID issue.
I do, but also I think as we notice as we come to the end of today with the theatre, but also a very toned down, sombre approach to the theatre, which reflects the year we've just had, I'm really stunned that the government thinks this is such a priority. It's certainly not what's coming up on the doorstep. There's very little evidence of any systematic fraud. Fixing a problem that doesn't exist when we've actually got big problems that do exist. It's not what was coming up on the doorstep where I was knocking. Whether people voted Labour or Tory, they were telling me about problems with crime, cuts to police, feeling that schools and public health services had suffered 11 years of Tory rule. They weren't saying, if only we had an ID card. Right. I think that's a real problem.
Joanna, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Sangam. I think she hit the nail on the head there at the end when she said, where is the evidence of the problem? I don't see the evidence of this problem. And I think we should be in the business of extending the franchise, as we've recently done in Scotland, not bringing in measures which might restrict people in exercising their right to vote. Now, at the election we've just had in Scotland, 16 and 17-year-olds voted, and so did refugees and foreign nationals with leave to remain. That's the sort of approach that we have in Scotland, and I think Boris Johnson's government would be better looking at extending the franchise in the way that we've done, rather than introducing measures which might stop people from exercising their democratic right.
We're back at the Sovereign's entrance, just for the departure of the Crown and the regalia, and back in reverse order. And again, we can see that there is a heavy presence of the most senior figures here from the household and from the offices here at Westminster. And the sword is being placed in the car, ready for that journey back. We go back to Buckingham Palace initially, and as I say, then back to the Tower of London, where they are kept usually. There was a time, by the way, looking at these cars, when the crown jewels would be brought down to the Palace of Westminster on the river by barge. And some of the officers in charge of this part of the ceremony were technically known as barge masters, even when the barges had long disappeared. But today, as we say, they are safely in the cars and on their way back. And I just think, while we're watching the crown and the symbol of authority leaving Westminster, Minister, could you just help us then, just on this, just to tie up this part of the debate, does the government sense that there is so much fraud that it is an issue?
I think it's an obvious hole in the system. It's just an obvious hole in the system. It's an individual right, as Sangham said. We all have a right to vote, but that's an individual right as for being as part of a franchise. And you have to register and you have to be on the electoral roll. And the only thing is that last part, when you actually go to exercise your vote, that you just prove that you're you. And, you know, from my perspective, when you look at designing systems, that actually is a better design of the system. So it would make sure that there wasn't any voter fraud. I mean, there have been talk about there being it, but there, you know, this would close that loophole. And that, I think, is important. It's important to have trust in the system. You know, it isn't the #1 priority.
But is there evidence that there is no trust?
But
is there evidence? Where's the evidence that there is no trust in the system, or the trust has declined in the system?
It's just got a design flaw, I think.
We've just had a record turnout in Scotland. You know, people are embracing democracy. This is a way, or a potential route, to stopping them from embracing democracy.
You have to say
what the government needs to do is to produce evidence that there's a problem. In Northern Ireland, people have had to do this for a long time because there was widespread evidence of voter fraud and voter abuse to do with particular circumstances there, which don't thankfully exist in Scotland, England or Wales. And it's astonishing to see the government putting so much effort into a new system for which they are unable to point to any evidence that it's required. You know, if there was evidence of a significant mischief here, then yes, I think all responsible politicians would need to sit down and look at what we do about it. But we know from other countries, such as the United States of America, that this can be a deterrent.
Fine. Quick word.
I think we've just got to think about why this priority. There's a certain number of bills that can take up parliamentary time. Why is this so close to the top of the list? 22, 23 bills, I lost count a little bit, but it's not that many. We have a limited amount of time. Why is this even making the cut when there's no evidence for a problem?
I think it's 30 bills.
Very little evidence that there's a problem there, when we've got other bigger problems such as a housing crisis and a climate change crisis to deal with, and which barely touch the sides of the speech.
Let's pause for a second because we've seen the cars leaving, and I think today's been the Queen's most high-profile engagement, as we said, since the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh. He was at her side at many state openings, all the way back to 1952. So we had a look through the archive at their attendance together across the decades.
Well, here in Central Lobby, I'm joined by Liz Saville-Roberts, who's the Westminster leader of Plaid Cymru. And Liz, you spoke in the MP's tribute to the Duke of Edinburgh after his death. Your reflections on the event today?
I think many people will see that somebody who once accompanied the Queen and was a tradition is no longer with us. And however people feel about the royal family, your heart cannot but go out to see a wife who has lost her husband and a son who has lost his father. And that these traditions, which are so familiar to us, are changing regardless.
And as to the substance of the Queen's speech today, what did you make of it?
Well, for somebody from Wales, it seems, I'm sad to say, bland and non-committal. We had the Prime Minister in 2019 standing on the steps of Downing Street and promising to fix social care once and for all. Now, social care is devolved in Wales, but as things stand and the way that matters are financed, we need to be enabled to provide social care that it's become so obvious that we desperately need after the last terribly difficult, terribly sad year. To be able to do that properly for a nation of Wales, we need this place to move effectively, to set an example and also to put the funding in place. And we've also seen this talk about levelling up, and yet we've also got the government here that is centralising more than ever before. It's one thing to make the political offers, it's another thing to actually really bring about levelling up and strengthen our communities in Wales and across the UK.
Thank you very much indeed, Liz. That's Liz Saville-Roberts from Plaid Cymru. Huw.
Rita, back with you in a moment. Laura, yes, the fixing social care line, which actually did have a lot of impact at the time, raising expectations really. Nothing in here that I saw about that.
No, nothing more than a sort of vague, oh yes, we know we have to get on with this. Now, the fact is that successive governments have failed to get to grips with this issue, revealed in such stark terms during the pandemic. You know, if people didn't realise that there was an issue in how we care for our elderly in this country, well, my goodness me, the COVID emergency certainly put that very much in a harsh spotlight. The Prime Minister made it absolutely central when he stood on the steps of Downing Street after he'd won the election, promising it would be fixed and that he had a plan. What's actually happening is that behind the scenes, number 10 and number 11 basically can't quite agree over how to get on with this. There are various models out there. We all know what they are. They've been discussed over the years. In a sense, there's sort of nothing really new in this debate. What there isn't is a decision.
OK. We'll be back for a final comment with my guests here in a moment. Back to Rita, who has another guest.
I'm joined now by Ian Paisley, a DUP MP for North Antrim. Ian, you were in the Royal Gallery just now to hear the Queen, a very different occasion from usual.
Yes, a very subdued occasion, Rita, from what's normally there, but still the pomp and ceremony, and wonderful to see Her Majesty looking so well after what's been a very trying time for her and the entire family. So wonderful to have Parliament opened in this way, despite the pandemic.
We heard in the Queen's speech, we heard Her Majesty talk about strengthening devolved government in Northern Ireland and addressing the legacy of the past. How do you interpret the government's intentions there?
Well, I take three things out of this. First of all, the new decade new approach. There's legislation which will now flow to Westminster as a result of that. We will wait and see what the government intends to do with that, and we will follow it. On the legacy issue, I think that, of course, is very important. The Stormont House Agreement, which was supposed to deal with this, has fallen apart quite literally, and we need to make sure that the vexatious attempts to try soldiers and police officers who served our nation so well during the Troubles, that they're protected from vexatious complaints and indeed unfounded allegations. And we've seen some progress in that in the courts in recent weeks. Then finally, improving the issue of connectivity within the devolution settlement. Well, that's the bit that excites me the most. We've seen a commitment to more bus building. For my constituency, that would be amazing, because we build lots of the buses for the United Kingdom, and this government has a lot to do in terms of providing jobs coming out of the pandemic. So there's things here for all of us.
Thank you very much indeed. That is Ian Paisley, DUP MP for North Antrim.
Rita, many thanks, and thanks to all of your guests who've been speaking to us during the programme. Just a few minutes left to get some final thoughts here in the studio, in the River Room. And by the way, can I just pass on my thanks to Lord McFall, the Lord Speaker, who kindly let us in here today. So having said that, John, I hope you let us back next time. OK, so many thanks to you for that. Final thought, just Minister first, just what do you want viewers to take away from this speech?
Focuses on national recovery, that's early years, lost learning, the NHS social care as well, investment in jobs, that levelling up opportunity and investment in jobs. There was a whole kind of things, Freeport, etc. Connectivity, buses, broadband and homes as well. And I think, you know, these are all really important. We've got to recover. We've got to work together as our four nations. I think that is really important as our four nations to work together on behalf of the people who put us here. And I do think, as Ian said, there's something there for everybody, but it is always about delivery. And I think what I want them to take away is that we will deliver this. We're committed to delivering this.
Okay. The expectations have been raised, Joanna. What did you make of it?
Well, I mean, as I said at the beginning, if this government is serious about levelling up, and if they mean by that, by creating equality and fairness, then they need to tackle some of the big issues in our society, such as child poverty. Now, there was some reference to children in the speech, but they would do well to take a leaf out of the Scottish Government's book. In the last session of Parliament, the SNP Scottish Government introduced a Scottish child payment. It's been described by the third sector as a game changer in dealing with child poverty in Scotland, and we committed to doubling it in our manifesto. Equally on the social care issue, let's see some meat on the bones. In Scotland, we had an independent review. The SNP committed to the principles of that independent review, and Nicola Sturgeon has said that she will introduce a national care service to oversee social care in Scotland within the term of the next Parliament. Finally, repeatedly in this speech, we heard that the government wanted to strengthen and renew democracy across the UK. The best way to strengthen and renew democracy would be to respect the outcome of the election we had in Scotland last week, which the SNP won. There are 72 MSPs in the Scottish Parliament who want a second independence referendum, as opposed to 57 who don't. Boris Johnson should come to the negotiating table, as David Cameron had the decency to do in 2011. The civil servant, Kieran Martin, who negotiated the Edinburgh Agreement after the SNP victory in 2011, has said that the circumstances that pertain now are exactly the same as they were in 2011, and that therefore the British government should come to the negotiating table. The pandemic must be dealt with, but the British government is getting on with other aspects of the Constitution during the pandemic, and they need to speak to Nicola Sturgeon and her new government in Edinburgh about a second independence
Joanna, that's
referendum.
another 3-hour programme, but thank you very much for raising the point. Thangham, a quick line from you, sorry.
I think after the terrible year that we've had, which the ceremony this morning really reflected, our social care sector, our health sector, our education sector deserve to know that they are getting the reward that they really, truly deserve. We deserve to have a government that really takes seriously the massive crisis of climate change, the massive housing crisis, just typified by the failure to get a grip on the cladding crisis, which has blighted so many people's lives. There's any number of things which could have been headlines in this speech and seem to me to be sadly lacking.
Thank you very much, Laura. You and I will speak later, I think. Yes?
Sure we will.
Thank you very much. And can I just say to all of you,
thank you.
Really good contributions, and thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. Thank you. Thank you all. It brings us to the end of our live coverage from the Palace of Westminster. A new session of Parliament has been opened by the Queen in her 95th year, and a new government programme has been set out, though, as we know, it's already controversial. Coverage of the debate on the speech will continue on the BBC News channel this afternoon. But from all of my guests here, from Laura and from me, from all of the BBC team at Westminster, thanks for watching and goodbye.